Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started in about another minute. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Ed, I'm going to ask that you turn your camera on, and I'm going to turn mine off. Hello and welcome to our final Special Collections and Archives program for the fall of 2021. I'm Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Director of Special Collections, and I would like to welcome you all. We appreciate you joining us for this program. Also, a special thank you to Rebecca Peterson-May, our Public Services Archivist, for her technical assistance. I would also like to thank and acknowledge the donors who make these programs possible, specifically Kathy and Andy Liverman, class of 77, and other ZSR Board of Visitor members. Their support has allowed us to expand our outreach events like this one to a broader audience. We are already in the beginning stages of program planning for the spring semester, and if you would like to be added to our mailing list, please let us know at archives@wfu.edu. Just some housekeeping items. Today's program will be coming to you via Zoom webinar, and no, unfortunately, we will not be able to see each other. However, once Ed has finished his remarks, you will be able to submit your questions for him in either the Q&A box or the chat box. Ed has also agreed to be recorded, so this presentation will be available on ZSR's YouTube channel shortly. Once the questions are submitted, I will also read them out loud for everybody to hear. And now about our speaker. Ed Southern, a native of Winston-Salem and Wake Forest alum, go Deacs, is the Executive Director of the North Carolina Writers Network, one of the largest writers organizations of its kind in the country. He also is the author of 5 books, as well as stories, poems, essays, reviews, columns, and plays. Prior to the NC Writers Network, he was Vice President of Sales and Marketing at the John F. Blair Publisher. He lives in Winston-Salem with his wife, Jamie Rogers Southern, who is the Executive Director for Bookmarks, our local literary nonprofit and bookstore, and their children. Today, Ed will be speaking about his new book, Fight Songs, a story of love and sports in a complicated South, a finalist for the 2022 Southern Book Prize. Ed, it's all yours.
"21 months we've been doing this. 21 months we've been doing this, and I start talking while I'm still muted. There we go. You'd think I'd know better by now. I guess I'm just nervous speaking sort of at my alma mater, which is a fun and exciting and strange experience, made even stranger by the times that we live in. As I was saying, when you couldn't hear me, thank you, Tanya, thank you, Rebecca, and everyone else at ZSR for setting this up. I'm delighted to be here with you today. We just really don't have an adequate language yet, even after 20 months, for how to describe this sort of situation. it's especially fun to be talking about this book, Fight Songs, because so much of it, almost all of it, is very much rooted in my experience, not just as a Wake Forest alum, but as a lifelong Wake Forest fan. As Tanya said, I was born in Winston-Salem, spent most of my childhood here, and spent long enough here to really sort of root myself in rooting for the Demon Deacons. My idea of college football was driving over to Grove Stadium on a Saturday, picking out pretty much any seat that you wanted because the stadium was always about half empty, watching the Deacons play, watching them lose far more often than they won. That's the idea that I took with me through the rest of my life. So that these days, when Truist Field is far more often full than it is empty, and the Deacons are far more likely to win than they are to lose, there's still a little bit of cognitive dissonance for me. I'm still getting used to it. I hope that the Deacons will continue winning long enough for it to become old hat for me in a way. I'm going to read to you from part of the opening chapter of Fight Songs, and then talk a little bit more about it. And then one of the many things that I regret about not being able to be on campus with everyone, with having to do this by Zoom, is it's going to make it a little bit harder for us to have the conversation that I would prefer to have. So I ask you to post your questions in the Q&A for Tanya to feed to me, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have, and to let y'all guide the direction that this discussion goes in as much as anything. This is from the opening chapter of Fight Songs. In the second week of March, the year of our Lord, our apparently angry Lord, 2020, I came back from a trip to Alabama, to my hometown of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, just in time for those high holy days of my home state, the Atlantic Coast Conference men's basketball tournament. The tournament began on a Tuesday with my team, my lifelong loyalty, the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, losing as a 12 seed to 13 seed Pitt. The second straight year the Deacons season had ended in the first and least tournament matchup. That sentence has at least 5 things wrong with it, none of them the facts, grammar, or spelling. Still, the tournament that year was back in the Greensboro Coliseum, its ancestral home, less than a half-hour drive from Winston-Salem. So even if I couldn't root for the team I was rooted in, I planned to go. I was writing a book about our roots and our rooting interests, about the South's favorite sports and how they're entangled with our histories and identities, about why North Carolina sets its seasons by college basketball when the Deep South sets theirs by college football. I had been in Alabama working on that book, my personal story about the stories we use to tell each other and ourselves who we are, my fun little book about sports hate and true love. This is not that book. For that book, I planned to drive over to Greensboro late Friday, go see what a ticket was going for in the parking lot, grab a barbecue sandwich from Stamey's across the street, and watch the tournament in Greensboro as of old, as God and the pilot intended, as every good North Carolinian should, once at least and as often as possible. Then, all of a sudden, I couldn't. Then, all of a sudden, the stories we told ourselves so long fell apart. I promise that all this I'm fixing to tell you is true, as best as I can tell. I am not a historian or a journalist, only a fan. My interest is not professional, but personal, intensely personal, haunted by 400 years upon this land, knotted by birth and raising, love and hate, virtue and sin, speech and even name. I've read much, but there's always more to read. I've remembered all I can, all I've seen and heard and felt and been told, but memory never was what it used to be. I've talked to some who were there when these things happened, or at least were there for parts of them, but they are getting older and fewer, and like all of us are like to fill in their gaps with a story they find congenial, and they only ever had the one view to begin with. I need you to know I'm looking not so much to explain as to explore, looking not for answers, but for more stories, mine and others, out of which I might piece together something close to understanding. I need you to know that I'm fixing to traffic in generalities as broad as a football field is long, to go on about North Carolina this and Alabama that, and the South and the South and the South, when the South is and always has been made of multitudes, each with their own hopes and passions and preferences for sporting pleasure, whatever the story in memory might be, however much most of them might have been silenced. I need you to know that in the course of this telling, I'm liable to say mean things about other schools' teams and their fans, but I promise you I say them with, well, not love, certainly, but not actual hate either. Only sports hate, which is not or should not be the same thing. I need you to know we could not have known nor possibly imagined how much we'd come to miss, not just the games themselves, but the blithe ability to grieve so much over games, over dangerous, predatory, contradictory games, to cherish so much and examine so little the stories we'd grown up with, the ones supposed to tell us who we are. I need you to know how little these games actually matter and how much they truly do. I need you to know how much we need to know where it all came from, how it all got to be like this, so that we might have some idea where it's going. Thank you. Excuse me while I take a drink. So the idea for this book originally was going to be, well, to be honest, it wasn't even going to be a book at all. It was going to be an essay, a short little piece, something lighthearted and I hoped funny, that examined the contrast between my being a native North Carolinian and a lifelong Wake Forest fan, and my wife being a Birmingham native and a lifelong Clemson Tide fan. Some of you may know the old Steely Dan song, Call Me Deacon Blues, the chorus of which goes, they have a name for the winners in the world. I want a name when I lose. They call Alabama the Crimson Tide. Call me Deacon Blues. Now, it turned out, it was revealed in 2015 that the songwriters didn't mean any insult to Wake Forest at all. They weren't even thinking of Wake Forest. They didn't know of Wake Forest. They just liked the word Deacon and associated it with Deacon Jones, the all-pro defensive end for the Los Angeles Rams at the time. Somehow that's even more fitting historically with Wake Forest football than if they had set out to insult the Deeks. But still, even this year, with Wake Forest about to play for an ACC championship, the national media especially tends to use Wake Forest as a shorthand for football futility. I very much appreciated Coach Clausen's comments in his press conference about the allotment of 6 tickets given to Wake Forest so that each of all of our fans could go to the ACC championship game. Which was a dig at some national broadcasters that I usually love, who had made a crack about the Wake Forest fan base. Contrast that with the Alabama Crimson Tide, which has become a shorthand for football dominance, especially this last decade with Nick Saban as the head coach, but even before then. And so I wanted to really just kind of make some jokes about that. But when I started writing, I started trying to figure out, or at least explore, why is there that difference? Why is Alabama a football state, North Carolina a basketball state? Are they really? What does that even mean? What's the difference between the Deep South and the so-called Upper South? Is there really a difference? Where does that border lie? What does it consist of? And once I started looking into these things and telling more of these stories that I found relevant, this little essay of mine just kept growing and growing and growing until it was over 12,000 words long. And I sent it to a friend of mine who is both the editor-in-chief at Blair and one of the editors of a wonderful online magazine called South Writ Large, for whom I'd written before. I asked her, I said, would you have any interest in this? She said, no, it's way too long for an online magazine. But then she asked me, would you be interested in expanding it into a book? And to be honest, my first answer was no, I didn't think there was enough there. But she talked me into it. And I'm glad that she did, because once I started really looking, there were so many stories that this initial story that I was trying to tell led into. There were so many questions that came up once I started asking the first questions that occurred to me. And it just kept going and going and going. And somewhere there is an alternate universe where this book is about this thick, instead of this thick as it turned out to be. There's so much that I left out that I could have included. And I even say in the afterward, I don't know that the stories that I did include are the best ones or the right ones. They're just the ones that struck me at the time. The story that I was telling you, of course, changed drastically over the course of 2020, when I was already well into writing the book. A lot of the issues of history, of economics, of culture, of identity were going to be in the book, but in my original plan, they were going to be a lot more tangential. And then those were the very issues that came roaring to the forefront of national life as 2020 went on, as we recognized and rather half-heartedly dealt with the pandemic in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement that had begun earlier in the last decade. Especially with so many college athletes taking the lead on that in their communities, speaking out very passionately, eloquently, and courageously. I've described this moment before, and it sounds so hokey, so like a scene from a bad movie, that I'm afraid people think I'm making it up, but I promise if I were making it up, I would come up with something much better than this. But that summer of 2020, I was working on the book. I write longhand, and so I was transcribing something that I had written, typing it up into a Word document, and I'm typing, and my fingers begin slowing down on the keyboard until eventually they just come to a stop. I sat back and I sighed, and I picked up the phone and I called my editor and said, I'm not going to be able to write this book the way I'd planned to, am I? And then she sighed and said, no, you can't. The world has changed too much. You have to address this. And so, I didn't rewrite the book by any means. I still used much of the material that I already had, but I certainly refocused it. I didn't toss out what I had written, but I tossed out the outline, the order in which I had put much of this, and reordered it. And chose to begin with the cancellation of the ACC tournament, which, especially for those of us who grew up in the ACC, grew up in Tobacco Road, and if you're old enough like me to remember the teachers fighting over the AV carts come quarterfinal Friday, back in olden days, there wasn't a screen in every classroom, and so teachers would have to check out an audio-visual cart from the AV room. It would have it was this big black rolling cart that would have a TV, a huge tube TV strapped to the top of it, and they would fight over who got to check that out on quarterfinal Friday of the ACC tournament. They'd roll it into the classroom, and nobody taught anything that Friday. School came to a stop while we turned on the game starting at noon and watched the ACC tournament until the final bell. And that was just, nobody thought anything of it. That was part of life here in North Carolina, and in parts of Virginia and South Carolina too. And so, one of the things I wanted to explore was, why did North Carolina come to a standstill for the ACC tournament while Alabama comes to a standstill for the Iron Bowl between Alabama and Auburn? And I wanted to explore not just the difference in those sports, basketball versus football, but the difference in the verb tense, past tense for North Carolina. My children never had a teacher come in, bring class to a halt for quarterfinal Friday of the ACC tournament. but Alabama still comes to a standstill for the Iron Bowl. What's the difference there? What changed? What didn't change? I'm going to read another fairly quick excerpt from the book that's talking a little bit about the I guess the arrival of the pandemic. I'm not sure that's the best word for it. And then I hope to open it up to your questions. What happened in those days happened so fast that even Twitter couldn't keep up. In those days and in the days to come, reporters didn't bother trying to tell the story, only to relate the events, channel a busted hydrant into a steady stream. Dominoes falling was the go-to metaphor, but those are too orderly, their cause and effect too clear. What all happened that tournament week was more like a lit match tossed into a state line service road fireworks stand. We stuck with the dominoes, though, because we all hoped so hard we'd soon be able to see the arrangement, the intended design, come to completion. Back then, we all expected order restored any minute now. I was far from the only teller who'd set out to tell one story, only to find myself in another, and then another, and then another. Wednesday, March 11th, the World Health Organization designated COVID-19 a global pandemic. Wednesday evening, or was it afternoon, the ACC announced they'd play the tournament in Greensboro Coliseum on Thursday as planned, but would lock the fans out. By Wednesday night, the NBA had suspended its season indefinitely. Thursday at noon, the ACC tournament was about to start, Clemson and Florida State in layup lines on the floor. Working from home, as I had since 2008, I'd set up my laptop on our kitchen table so I could work, eat, and watch the games all at once. I turned on the TV and saw the players warming up. I turned away to fix a sandwich. When I turned back, the tournament was done. 15 minutes after noon, the ACC called it off, as the rest of the NCAA's top-tier Power 5 conferences, the Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the Southeastern Conference, had already. By Thursday night, the NCAA had canceled its men's and women's basketball tournaments and all other remaining winter sports championships and all spring sports championships. By Friday morning, the ACC had suspended all athletic competition, quote, until further notice. The SEC had suspended sports until first March 30th and then April 15th. By Friday evening, Augusta National Golf Club had postponed the Masters until, quote, some later date. NASCAR had postponed its next two races. Major League Baseball had shut down spring training and pushed back opening day until April 9th. By Monday morning, though, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta was calling for all gatherings of more than 50 people to be canceled for the next 8 weeks, a span that reached mid-May. And anonymous insiders were telling reporters we might not have organized spectator sports again until June at the earliest. By the end of the month, almost 4,000 Americans had died of the new coronavirus, and more than 10 million had lost their jobs. And we were worried about our fun and games. Games, sports, even college sports, especially college sports, especially in the South, especially college football and college basketball, stopped being mere games a long, long time ago, and maybe never were. Big-time college sports are economic engines and schools' most effective advertisements. They used to call a winning football or basketball program a college's front porch, and sometimes still do. Varsity sports are supposed to be a school's most visible, but least essential feature. That has been a lie a long time, and the pandemic proved it. Thank you. I can read some more, I can talk some more, maybe coherently, maybe not, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Tanya, have we gotten any submitted to us?
Not yet, but I will ask one. If you
Please.
had, if you don't mind, if you had to choose the most poignant loss or the most exhilarating win you ever personally experienced, what would they be?
Oh boy, the most exhilarating win has to be the 1995 ACC tournament championship. When we, as if I was on the court, when the Deacons beat UNC in overtime. That was the game that featured Randolph Childress's step back three when he motioned for Jeff McInnes. I was at the ACC tournament that year. I was in the upper deck of Greensboro Coliseum, and will admit, I admitted it in print in the book. I will admit it to you now. I was weeping openly to win the ACC tournament, which I'd never seen. It had not happened before in my lifetime. And to do it in a thrilling game in overtime against Carolina was, it was almost too, if someone wrote that into a novel or a screenplay, it would be rejected as too fairy tale, it's too unrealistic. That was a beautiful moment. Second, of course, has to be winning the 2006 ACC football championship against Georgia Tech. Again, it was a, the win. It wasn't the game itself wasn't as thrilling as that ACC champion, the 1995 ACC championship was, but to see Wake Forest win an ACC title in football, again, was something that I had never seen in my lifetime, and frankly never expected to. So that would be the second. I'm not even going to get into the losses. I'm feeling too good. Wake Forest is having too good of a week. I was there last night in the Joel, which is why my voice is a little scratchy today, to watch the overtime win against Northwestern. So we're not going to talk about losses today.
Well, we had a question come in, and it asks, what's your favorite ACC rivalry?
Well, all right. One of the things that I write about in the book is how I'm not going to say it's the worst thing about being a Wake Forest fan, but I think it drives most Wake Forest fans the craziest, is that, at least to this point, no one in the ACC considers Wake Forest to be their biggest rival. In fact, some of you may watch the show Packer and Durham on the ACC network, and Mark Packer refers to Wake Forest as Switzerland because it's a beautiful place that nobody hates. That's sort of a perpetual neutral in sports, at least as far as other teams are concerned. Carolina would say their biggest rival is Duke. State would say their biggest rival is Carolina. Duke would say their biggest rival is, I don't know, the Justice Department, or maybe Harvard. So it's that's frustrating. I think the rivalry that I enjoy the most and have enjoyed the longest is the rivalry with Carolina. There's a lot of, Wake Forest and Carolina played the first collegiate football game in North Carolina. Wake Forest won, by the way. And, there's, I don't know, I quote Dr. Wilson in the book. He when I was a student, I made some sort of joke about Carolina to him, and he said, he never could truly hate North Carolina or hate UNC because it is the University of North Carolina, the university of the home state, of which we're both very proud. So I think that's the one that I enjoy the most. I don't know. That's not a great answer. That's sort of a meandering answer, but I hope that is satisfactory at least.
All right, we've had a couple more come in. I'm reading this one directly. Speaking of fight songs, got an all-time favorite such song? Care to bust a few rhymes?
No, I am not going to bust a few rhymes. Nobody wants to hear that, especially not the condition that my throat's in today. My favorite fight song is the Wake Forest fight song. And I mean, obviously I'm extremely biased, but I do feel like Oh Here's to Wake Forest is one of the best, just musically, it's one of the best fight songs in the country. It's a original and, as far as I know, unique to Wake Forest, unlike States or some other fight songs I could think of. It's not generic at all. It's not like the usual homilies. It's the lyrics are interesting. I really do. I think Wake Forest has one of the best fight songs that I've ever heard.
Okay, here's another question. Our questioner claims to not have a very high sports IQ, but they grew up in the area and they remember watching the games during school. They finished high school in 2007. Do you think the lack of enthusiasm or buy-in is because the ACC basketball conference just isn't as great as it was? Is it a talent pool that's more widespread?
I think the waning of the fixation on the ACC tournament, and to some extent on ACC basketball, is due to a number of factors. I think in the triad, and certainly in Winston-Salem, I think part of it is that Wake Forest just hasn't been very good in basketball for a decade now, over a decade now. So I know that's had an impact on my enjoyment of the game. But I think there's a host of other factors. I think the expansion of the ACC has something to do with it. I didn't ask her if I could talk about this, so I don't know if I should. But so in my day job, my account manager with this web platform that we use, is the daughter of a Hall of Fame basketball coach whose team recently joined the ACC as a product of expansion. And she and I have talked about it and said that, and she doesn't mean this as an insult. She said, ACC history means nothing to her. Why would it? It's not the history that she grew up with. Pac-12 history means nothing to me. Why would it? I can appreciate it and, on kind of an academic level, and so I think, with the expansion, there is some dilution there of passion for it, some diminishment of that. I think also, honestly, as the public schools have become subject to more and more testing, teachers don't have the leeway they once did. So they don't feel comfortable. They don't feel that they're able to let the kids watch the ACC tournament. They're afraid they'll get in trouble, and they probably would. That's sad. I think North Carolina has experienced a lot of growth. A lot of folks moving here who are not from the state originally, and they bring with them their own allegiances. They don't care about the ACC tournament. Again, who can blame them? North Carolina's had a lot of growth, and we have pro teams now, which we didn't have when I was a kid. I was a high school sophomore or junior when the Charlotte Hornets arrived. And that seemed miraculous that, we could have an NBA franchise, right down in Charlotte. That just seemed amazing. And now you have, the Hornets, you have the Carolina Panthers, you have the Carolina Hurricanes. That takes away fans, takes away fan interest. My publicist for this book is a fairly young UNC graduate, fairly recent UNC graduate, grew up in Charlotte and told me flat out, she's not really an ACC fan. She's a Carolina Panthers fan. That's where she roots herself. So it's all, I think there are a host of factors that play a role in the ACC tournament. And then, of course, the ACC tournament now expanding, where it's no longer the compact first 3-day, then 4-day kind of festival of basketball. Again, now it starts on Tuesday and goes to Saturday. And so it's a lot harder to, it's not just one day that you can take off to watch the ACC tournament. It's a succession. You have to take a whole week off, and a few people can do that. So.
All right, here's a really good question. About the only thing we might love more than college sports in the South is our food. In North Carolina, it's barbecue. In other areas, it's other fare. Can you talk about the interrelationship between food and sports in the tailgate culture?
Well, first of all, I'd say that there are probably a lot of things that we in the South love more than sports and food. It's just that sports and food we can love and actually be proud of, if we try to approach them in an equitable and honest way. that's actually one of the aspects I probably didn't consider enough. In terms of the tailgating culture and the food. I mean, so we have friends that live right up the street from us who are from, they're both from New Orleans, and they both went to LSU, and they talk about getting season tickets for Wake Forest football and seeing what that's like, and I almost, it's like, oh God, it's going to be so much less than what you're used to. LSU is legendary for its tailgate culture. But then Louisiana is legendary for its food. I mean, North Carolina, be awfully hard to barbecue a hog in a parking lot. And so, I mean, yeah, you can set up a grill, but it's just not quite the same thing. Most of our traditional foods are harder to fix in a parking lot, out of the back of a car or the back of a truck. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. I do love very little more than getting some good barbecue and bringing it and eating it in the parking lot before a Wake Forest game, though. So
Here's another question. They want to know if you've looked at the 1950s quarterfinals Thursday when the games were just on the radio on the Tobacco Sports Network.
mhm. I mean, I'm aware of that. That's how it used to be. And one of the things that I write about in the book is how, most people trace, well, I write about how the ACC began because of football. The ACC was founded to be a football conference. And, the switch to it becoming a basketball conference, the forces to do that were already in place before the ACC was founded. Everett Case came to NC State in, I think, 46 or 47. But it's still, it was a gradual shift, and most people name the turning point as Carolina winning the 1957 national championship over Kansas and Wilt Chamberlain. And it was interesting, reading more about that yes, the fact that they won a national championship was huge, but it wasn't just that they won a national championship. It was that they won the national championship in 2 consecutive triple overtime games. Both the semifinals and the finals went to triple overtime. They were thrillers, and both of them were televised. C.D. Chesley who later founded what became the Jefferson Pilot Raycom broadcasting network that so many of us are familiar with, had the vision to think, I think people would want to watch this. And for the semifinals, he convinced 3 stations in North Carolina to carry his feed of the semifinal game with Carolina. There was one in Wilmington, one in, I think, Durham, and one in either Greensboro or Charlotte. And then for the finals, he convinced 2 more to pick it up. And so not only could North Carolinians, read about it the next day in the paper and listen to it on the radio at the time, but they could see it happen, and they could watch this game live, and see how exciting and fast paced it could be. And that in itself played a huge, the fact that North Carolina had prospered enough economically that a significant number of North Carolinians could afford televisions, played a huge part in that. That's a way where, economic history, cultural history kind of goes hand in hand with sports history, because up until the mid 20th century, North Carolina was one of the poorest states in the Union. And that began to change. And had that not begun to change, wouldn't have been enough North Carolinians to see Carolina win that national championship for the state to begin to fall in love with basketball. So I kind of veered away from your original question. I hope you don't mind.
All right, we've had a couple come in the chat. First, is there some story about an ACC sports rivalry being the reason we have Good Friday as a holiday?
That's a great question. And actually it's reversed. For the longest time, I want to say until the 1970s, but I could be wrong about that, North Carolina did not have Good Friday as the Easter holiday, but Easter Monday instead. And the reason for that was sometime around the turn of the century, Wake Forest, back when it was in the town of Wake Forest, and NC State began to play an Easter Monday baseball game that became an annual tradition. They would play it at the state fairgrounds outside Raleigh. There would be special trains chartered to take fans out to this. It was a huge deal. And because of this rivalry, because of the how big this game was, North Carolina businesses, banks tended to be closed on Easter Monday rather than on Good Friday. That changed when the banking industry in North Carolina began to take off in the 1970s, with the rise of what was then NCNB and First Union. And they said, we can't keep doing this. We can't work on Good Friday when all the other banks are closed, but then be closed on Easter Monday when all the other banks are open. And they lobbied the legislature to get that changed. And so finally, the rivalry, the importance of the Easter Monday baseball game had already begun to decline, partly because of the rise of college basketball. Here you had this game that was played either in, early to mid-April usually, or sometimes even in late March. Well, you just got done with March Madness. That's where people's attention was focused. So they didn't care as much about the Easter Monday baseball game. That, combined with the pressure from the banks, caused the North Carolina legislature to switch and make Good Friday the holiday rather than Easter Monday. Great question.
Here's another really good question. How do you reconcile your enthusiasm about college sports with a recognition of the inherent exploitative nature of these revenue generating sports?
With great difficulty. And I argue in the book and elsewhere, athletes should be paid. College athletes should be paid. I might have bought the argument that that a scholarship was sufficient compensation back in the days when the money part of the money sports meant ticket sales and booster donations. Okay, fine. But in this age of multi-million dollar media rights deals with so much money flowing in for everyone involved but the players themselves, I just don't see how that's defensible. And the new name, image, and likeness legislation that took effect this summer is a good first step. But even so, and I put it this way, never mind the coaching salaries or anything like that. As one, I interviewed a historian, William Sturkey, who teaches at UNC, and he pointed out, if you're a bartender at a local bar, you're going to make more money when the football and basketball teams are doing well, because you're going to have more people coming in to town to see games. You're going to have them in a good mood celebrating afterwards. You're going to do well financially through the success of this football or basketball team. The player is not. I could go out, if you've got a star player, I could go out and go to the local screen printers and print up a bunch of Sam Hartman t-shirts and go stand on the corner of University Parkway and Deacon Boulevard and sell these t-shirts, at least until the cops run me off, and make a decent bit of money off of that. Sam Hartman isn't going to see a dime of it. That's just wrong. How many Chris Paul jerseys did the Deacon shop sell? I mean, at the game last night, I still see people wearing Chris Paul and Tim Duncan jerseys. And obviously Chris Paul and Tim Duncan are doing fine financially, but it's just wrong that so many people make some money off of that, except for Tim Duncan and Chris Paul. So that's a good start. But I think when you look at the demands that are placed on the athletes, they need some compensation more than just cost of attendance. So that would be one that would at least ease my mind and conscience quite a bit.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Ed? Okay, Ed, I think you've answered everybody's questions. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Again, this has been recorded, so it'll be added to the ZSR YouTube channel. And we hope you'll come back for our spring programming. And also, Rebecca put a link in the chat to the bookmarks page where you can buy Ed's book. And have a good evening, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you all.